The most humiliating and simultaneously most liberating confrontation that Rudolf Steiner described in lectures restricted to advanced students of anthroposophy was not a battle against external demonic forces, nor was it overcoming obvious worldly temptations. But it was an inevitable and inescapable moment when a spiritual seeker, who had practiced meditative disciplines for years, believing he was progressing steadily toward enlightenment, was forced to encounter a figure Steiner called the guardian of the threshold, a presence that materialized not in the external physical world, but in inner dimensions of expanded consciousness, revealing with surgical precision and without mercy every discrepancy between who a person thought he was and who he really was, every spiritual pretension that masked worldly motivations, every self-proclaimed virtue that was just vice in disguise, every imagined spiritual achievement that was merely ego inflation dressed in a new guise of esoteric vocabulary. This meeting, according to Steiner, was not optional for souls who sincerely sought spiritual development, but was an obligatory portal that separated those who were prepared to access supersensitive perception of spiritual dimensions from those who still lived in fundamental illusions about their own nature and who would therefore inevitably abuse expanded capabilities by serving ego instead of evolution, manipulating others instead of serving compassionately, seeking personal power instead of contributing to the collective good of evolving humanity. A função essencial de guardião, portanto, não era bloquear progresso caprichosamente, mas era assegurar que apenas pessoas que desenvolveram autoconhecimento suficiente para reconhecer próprias projeções e distorções ganhavam acesso a dimensões onde estas distorções podiam causar danos não apenas a si mesmas, mas a estruturas de realidade espiritual que eram maleáveis a pensamentos e intenções de formas que realidade física densa não era, porque operavam segundo leis diferentes, onde consciência tinha poder formativo direto, moldando experiência através de qualidade de awareness, em vez de requerer mediação através de ação física lenta e laboriosa. The central concept that Steiner repeatedly emphasized when describing Guardian was that he was not an independent external entity that existed separately from the person confronting him, but was the objectification and personification of his own collective shadow. Literally everything that person was, but refused to acknowledge. Everything that he did but rationalized as justified, every potential he possessed but did not develop, every weakness he carried but projected onto others as if it were their problem rather than his own. The experience that virtually everyone reported was of being in a deep meditative state, when inner perception suddenly registered the presence of a form or figure that was not ordinary mental imagination that the person could control or dissolve at will, but was perception on a different level of reality that had the quality of being objective and autonomous, confronting awareness with an intensity that forced recognition, even when the person desperately tried to deny or rationalize what was being shown. This figure took on dramatically different appearances for each individual, because it was shaped precisely by the specific configuration of unintegrated shadow that characterized particular psyche. Person whose dominant denial was repressed rage via Guardian as monster of destructive fury displaying violence that he unconsciously desired to inflict but civilly suppressed. Person inflated with spiritual pride via arrogant tyrant despising everyone as inferior, revealing royal attitude beneath a veneer of performative humility. Person terrified of vulnerability via pathetic creature clinging desperately to any source of security, external exposing a denied dependence. A person who repressed sexuality via a grotesque form of limitless lust or reverence, showing desires distorted by repression. In each singular case, Guardian was a mirror that neither lied nor sugarcoated, but showed with brutal honesty exactly what was present when all layers of protective self-deception were peeled away, revealing the core of being in all its unedited complexity. The fundamental reason why this encounter was necessary before one could cross the threshold into supersensitive perception was that viewing spiritual realities through the filters of unrecognized illusions about oneself inevitably distorted perceptions in ways that confirmed existing prejudices rather than revealing objective truths that could contradict established beliefs. A person who denied his own capacity for cruelty would interpret encounters with spiritual beings through this filter, seeing only goodness in some and only malevolence in others, projecting unrecognized inner division into the external cosmos, instead of recognizing that both compassion and destructiveness potentially existed in nature itself, and that only when both were consciously recognized and integrated could perception of spiritual dimensions be relatively objective rather than merely reflecting unrecognized contents of one's psyche. Similarly, a person who did not recognize his own spiritual pride would interpret spiritual experiences as confirmations of special superiority, rather than recognizing that access to spiritual dimensions was a universal potential available to anyone willing to do the necessary preparatory work, and which did not confer elevated status, but carried additional responsibilities to use ethically expanded perception in the service of collective evolution rather than personal inflation. Guardian, therefore, functioned as a test, discriminating between those who had done real self-knowledge work by consciously integrating shadow aspects, and those who merely adopted spiritual identity as a new form of ego operating according to the same old patterns of seeking superiority, avoiding vulnerability, and especially avoiding honest confrontation with aspects of character that were uncomfortable to recognize, but that operated destructively when kept in the shadow of unconsciousness. The typical sequence of emotional reactions that a person experienced during an encounter with the Guardian followed a pattern that Steiner observed repeatedly through work with countless students. First, it was shock denial, where the person tried to argue that revelations were false or exaggerated by refusing to accept that aspects shown were actually parts of themselves. Then it was anger projecting responsibility onto others or external circumstances, trying to keep the self-image of an innocent victim intact rather than recognizing one's own contribution to problematic patterns. Then it was bargaining, trying to negotiate preservation of some favorite illusions in exchange for abandoning others less important, as if one could selectively choose which truths to accept, followed by despair when the full magnitude of systematic self-deception became inescapable feeling that if truth about oneself was so devastating, then transformation was impossible and spiritual failure was inevitable. Only eventually, after working through these defensive reactions that were manifestations of ego trying desperately to maintain identity structures that were being demolished, could genuine acceptance emerge, where one recognized without rationalization that revelations were true and that real work of transformation could only begin now that the full truth about one's current starting point was known rather than obscured by comforting illusions about being more spiritually advanced than one actually was, according to criteria that mattered of demonstrable transformation of character rather than just the acquisition of esoteric knowledge or correct execution of practices. Meditative actions that could be performed without genuine penetration into depths where real change took place. The specific revelation that Guardian often presented that was especially devastating to serious spiritual practitioners was to show that the entire project of seeking spiritual development was tainted by motivations that were fundamentally opposed to the path's stated purposes. Seeking spiritual powers not to serve the evolution of humanity, but to feel special and superior to others who did not have access to esoteric knowledge and abilities. Practicing disciplines not to dissolve ego through honest confrontation with limitations, but to construct inflated spiritual identity that was ego in new guise, operating by the same old standards of comparison. Competitive and seeking validation, studying teachings not to develop humility in the face of vastness of cosmic mysteries that remained beyond complete understanding, but to accumulate knowledge that created a sense of intellectual superiority over the uninitiated. This reversal, where spiritual seeking turned out to be serving ego that was supposedly being transcended, was particularly difficult to accept, because it required recognizing that years of practice that one sincerely believed were leading toward enlightenment were largely elaborate performance-keeping illusions intact, rather than genuine work of transformation, which was much more difficult, and which most people, including herself, avoided by replacing appearances of spirituality with real substance of interchange, demonstrable in patterns of behavior in everyday life, that were true tests of development rather than dramatic experiences in meditative states that they could easily be confused with real progress, but Guardian ruthlessly discriminated, separating illusion from truth. The essential work that had to happen before and after confrontation with the Guardian was not merely recognizing intellectually revealed aspects by adding them to the mental inventory of one's characteristics, but it was allowing recognition to penetrate emotionally, transforming fundamental relationship with oneself from alternating between harsh judgment and defensive inflation to compassionate acceptance of shared humanity, where imperfections were not unique. Moral flaws condemning a person as an evil exception in a universe of good beings, but where universal conditions of incarnated existence in a current stage of evolution where all human beings struggled with the same basic categories of challenges, even if specific forms varied according to individual histories. This shift in perspective from judgment to compassion was not condoning destructive behavior, nor was it excusing responsibility by saying, everyone does it, so it's okay, but it was recognizing that dark aspects developed as responses to wounds, traumas, and unmet needs that deserved compassionate understanding, rather than harsh rejection that only deepened internal division by pushing aspects into deeper levels of unconsciousness, where they operated destructively without the possibility of conscious direction. When a person could look at the anger revealed by Guardian and recognize that it had developed as a protective response to experienced injustices that were never adequately processed, rather than seeing it merely as a moral failure proving that he was not a good person, compassion began to emerge, allowing for a different relationship with anger, where it was no longer an enemy to be suppressed, but was energy that, when recognized and channeled consciously, could serve important purposes of establishing healthy boundaries and upholding values that mattered. The progressive transformation that occurred as one worked honestly through multiple encounters with the Guardian over weeks or months was not elimination of aspects revealed as if they could be excised like malignant tumors, but it was integration where aspects that had been denied were recognized as parts of the whole to be worked through consciously, rather than operating autonomously in the shadows, causing harm through unconscious projections and acting out. As this work of integration progressed through compassionate inner dialogue with dark aspects inquiring about their origins and needs, rather than just condemning them as unacceptable, Guardian's appearance literally changed from terrifying figure-blocking passage to less threatening presence, and eventually, in some cases, to ally or even dissolved completely when aspects it represented were sufficiently integrated and ceased to exist as a separate entity because they had been brought back into conscious personality totality where they could be deliberately directed rather than operated compulsively. This transformation of Guardian from enemy to ally or from obstacle to open portal did not happen through willpower, nor through forced techniques trying to manipulate experience, but happened naturally as a consequence of a genuine change in inner relationship where the person developed the capacity to embrace the totality of being, including aspects that he previously rejected because they threatened the self-image he had built, but which Guardian demonstrated to be illusory, requiring abandonment if authentic development was to occur. The crucial question of why the encounter with Guardian must be so brutal and why it could not be alleviated through a gentler approach revealed Steiner's deep understanding of the psychology of self-deception that was extremely resilient and would resist any revelation that was not absolutely inescapable through the mechanisms of rationalization, minimization, and projection that the ego automatically employed to protect established identity structures against the threat of contradictory information. Only confrontation that was so intense and unambiguous that it allowed no escape through habitual defenses could penetrate multiple layers of psychological protection, forcing genuine recognition rather than superficial recognition that was quickly forgotten or distorted as soon as intensity of confrontation subsided, allowing ego to reassume control and restore comforting narratives. Guardian's apparent brutality, therefore, was not cruelty, but was a deeper compassion that knew that only through complete demolition of illusions could authentic foundation be established upon which real development could be built, and that attempt to preserve any illusion, however small, would inevitably compromise the entire process. Because preserved illusions would function as footholds for ego to reconstruct complete defensive structures as soon as confrontational pressure was relieved. Steiner saw clearly that the ego was extremely ingenious in adapting and surviving through increasingly sophisticated strategies of self-deception, and that only through confrontation that was absolute and total could one be forced to find deeper identity that did not depend on the maintenance of illusions, but that emerged from direct connection with spiritual reality that was permanent, rather than from temporary constructions of personality that were useful, but that must eventually be transcended if authentic wholeness was to be achieved. The specific ability that allowed a person to pass through an encounter with the Guardian without collapsing into psychological fragmentation was what Steiner called the inner witness or observer that had been developed through years of meditative practice. The ability to observe psychic processes, including thoughts, emotions, impulses, and even sense of self as phenomena arising and passing without being completely identified with them, nor completely determined by them. This witness allowed maintaining a dual perspective during confrontation, where the person could recognize that revelations were true about patterns operating in the psyche, but that they were not the definitive totality of who they were, because there was also the ability to observe these patterns and to consciously choose how to respond instead of reacting automatically. And this freedom of choice, even if small initially, was a seed of genuine autonomy that would grow through deliberate cultivation over time as the person consistently practiced choosing conscious responses instead of automatic reactions. Without development of this witness through years of preparatory practice, encounter with Guardian would simply be traumatic rather than transformative, because one would be completely overwhelmed by revelations without inner resources to process constructively. And it was precisely for this reason that Steiner insisted that development of preliminary capacities through specific exercises was absolutely necessary before confrontation could be permitted or productive. The promise that Steiner offered to people who had the courage to confront Guardian honestly, rather than flee through denial or give up through despair, was that on the other side of the unmasking process awaited freedom that was impossible, while a person was trapped in needing to maintain illusions, to protect a fragile ego from uncomfortable truths. Freedom did not mean the absence of challenges, nor did it mean having completely transcended all imperfections and achieving impossible perfection. But it meant no longer being trapped in automatic patterns operating unconsciously, because they were now recognized and could be worked on deliberately, no longer being dominated by a compulsive need for external approval. Because I had found an inner source of validation that did not depend on the opinions of others, no longer being fragmented. Between acceptable aspects that were shown publicly and unacceptable aspects that were hidden in shame, but was integrated into wholeness, where all aspects were recognized e nenhum precisava ser negado, porque a pessoa havia desenvolvido força interior para tolerar a verdade completa sobre si mesma sem desmoronar. This freedom gained through honest confrontation with the guardian was a mark of authentic spiritual maturity that contrasted dramatically with performative spirituality, where people adopted spiritual vocabulary and practices, but studiously avoided real work of transformation that was difficult and often painful, but was the only path to genuine development that was not merely superficial. The deeper meaning of "hear the masks fall" that Steiner emphasized was not that a person would never again wear masks to present different aspects in different contexts, which was healthy and necessary social adaptation, but that they were no longer trapped in masks through unconscious identification, thinking that masks were the totality of who they were, and that they now had the freedom to consciously wear and remove masks as appropriate for specific contexts, knowing that true identity resided beyond all temporary constructions of personality and was anchored in connection with a spiritual source that was permanent, through all changes and transformations. A person who had successfully crossed guardian did not lose the ability to function socially by presenting appropriate aspects of themselves in different situations, but they were no longer completely identified with any particular mask, nor were they terrified of being seen without masks, because they had found inner wholeness that did not depend on maintaining external appearances to feel valid or worthy. This transformation from a relationship with prison masks to a tool used consciously, and it was a fundamental liberation that allowed authenticity in relationships, where one could be vulnerable when appropriate, because one was no longer desperately protecting fragile ego through rigid defenses, and simultaneously could maintain healthy boundaries by setting limits on how much one revealed in contexts where complete vulnerability would be unwise without feeling like one was being inauthentic. Because authenticity did not mean total disclosure in all circumstances, but meant acting consciously from a center of wholeness rather than reacting automatically from defensive fragmentation. The final and deepest dimension of guardian encounter that Steiner revealed only to more advanced students was that this was not a single event that happened once and then was complete, but was an ongoing process that deepened through multiple confrontations over years as one advanced in spiritual development and reached successively deeper levels of self-knowledge, revealing layers of illusions that had been invisible at earlier stages, because they were protected by more superficial layers that had to be worked through first before deeper layers could be accessed. Each level of development brought its own encounter with the guardian, revealing illusions specific to that level that must be confronted and integrated before the next level could be reached. And as one progressed through successive levels, confrontations became simultaneously more subtle and deeper because they involved more fundamental illusions about the nature of reality and self that were more difficult to recognize, because they were so deeply ingrained in the structure of consciousness that they seemed to be simply how reality was, rather than being constructs that could be questioned and transcended. At the more advanced levels of development that Steiner described as accessible only to initiates who had dedicated multiple lives to intensive spiritual work, even distinction between self and other revealed itself as an illusion that had to be transcended through recognizing the fundamental unity of all consciousness that was veiled by appearances of separation on more superficial levels of reality, and confrontation with the guardian at these levels required one to let go of identification. With separate individuality that in earlier stages had been a true identity to be discovered beneath social masks, but which now revealed itself as a subtler mask that protected identification, even deeper with universal consciousness that was the source of all particular individualities. The permanent invitation that Steiner's teachings offered was to begin the process of voluntary unmasking through regular practices of honest self-observation before life forces confrontation, through crises that traumatically demolish illusions, by consistently practicing asking where masks were operating, where comforting narratives were distorting perception, where self-deceptions were impeding growth by keeping one trapped in limitations that could be transcended if truth were courageously confronted rather than defensively avoided. This practice of regular self-examination was much less traumatic than sudden confrontation with Guardian revealing all illusions simultaneously, and allowed for working through progressively deeper layers of self-deception at a pace that could be integrated without overloading the psychological system with revelations too devastating to process constructively. Through sustained dedication to practices of gradual voluntary unmasking, performed disciplinedly over years, one would eventually reach the point of being sufficiently prepared to consciously meet Guardian, where confrontation would be deepening and confirming a process already begun, rather than a completely unexpected shock devastating a person who had not developed the resources to work through revelations in ways that resulted in growth rather than trauma. And this adequate preparation made all the difference between confrontation that was transformative, allowing one to cross the threshold into supersensitive perception, and confrontation that was simply destructive, forcing person to retreat into even more rigid defenses, attempting to restore illusions that were demolished prematurely before alternative foundations of authentic identity could be established to replace older structures that had proven to be illusory, but were all the person knew and were therefore abandoned only with great reluctance and suffering that was only worth it when rewarded by discovery of deeper wholeness that transcended limitations of artificially constructed identities through internalization of external expectations rather than emerging organically from the authentic core of being that had always been present, waiting for recognition, but which had been obscured by multiple layers of social conditioning and psychological defenses built as necessary protections in early stages, but which became prisons when held too rigidly, preventing growth beyond structures established in childhood and adolescence that were appropriate then, but which severely limited possibilities in adult life, where genuine maturity required transcending identifications established in earlier stages by discovering a deeper identity that was not defined by social roles nor by comparisons with others, but which emerged from direct connection with a universal spiritual source that all shared, but that each person owed, discovering individually through having the courage to confront Guardian who waited each soul on the threshold, separating comfortable illusion from uncomfortable truth, showing without mercy or softening, where one really was in development rather than where one imagined one was, based on illusions that protected ego, but also imprisoned in limitations that could only be transcended when full truth was recognized, allowing genuine work of transformation to begin from solid foundation of honest self-knowledge rather than quicksand of systematic self-deception that seemed solid only because one avoided testing one's foundations through questioning rigorous that would reveal the fragility of structures built on illusions that would eventually collapse either through voluntary confrontation with the Guardian or through life crises forcing recognition of avoided truths. The final wisdom that emerged from working deeply with Steiner's Guardian teachings was recognition that brutal confrontation that felt like punishment was in fact supreme act of cosmic compassion, because only through complete demolition of illusions that kept one imprisoned in self-imposed limitations could genuine freedom be achieved, allowing realization of true potential that remained latent while vital energy was consumed in maintaining psychological defenses, protecting fragile ego from truths that must eventually be confronted if authentic development was to occur. Guardian, therefore, was not an enemy but an ally in disguise, whose essential function was to remove obstacles that a person had created through years of systematic self-deception, and that now prevented further progress by keeping him trapped in patterns established in previous stages that had served purposes then, but that now limited possibilities for growth that could only occur when a person had the courage to let go of old structures. Discovering that deeper identity awaiting revelation was far more vast and capable than the artificially constructed personality that had defended so vigorously against imaginary threats, thinking that without these defenses it would not survive, when in fact only through letting go of defenses could genuine vitality emerge, releasing energies that had been trapped in maintaining masks that were exhausting to maintain, but that were abandoned only when one recognized that the cost of maintaining them exceeded the benefits of protection they offered, and that the alternative of living authentically without masks, although frightening because unfamiliar, was in fact much less exhausting than constant performance of being who others expected rather than who one truly was in depths of being that could only be discovered through having the courage to meet Guardian at the threshold where masks fell, revealing naked truth that was simultaneously more humiliating and more glorious than any fantasy the ego had constructed about itself protecting itself. Against recognition of mediocrity that was a universal condition, but that also obscured recognition of divine potential that was equally universal, but remained unfulfilled in the overwhelming majority of people who lived entire lives without ever confronting. Guardian choosing security of familiar illusions over freedom of uncomfortable truth, not recognizing that illusions would eventually collapse, whether through voluntary confrontation in life or through panoramic review after death, that all. Souls must undergo showing complete truth about life, lived without possibility of self-deception continuing, because spiritual dimensions operated according to laws of total transparency, where thoughts and intentions were visible directly without mediation of language that could be used to obscure uncomfortable truths, and where only genuine authenticity was possible, forcing person to eventually confront what they had avoided during life through multiple avoidance strategies that were tolerated. During incarnation as part of a learning process, but that could not continue after death when soul returned to dimensions where truth was ambience, where illusions could not be sustained because there was no structure of dense physical reality, offering resistance against which ego could define itself, maintaining illusion of separation, which was a necessary condition of incarnate existence, but which progressively dissolved after death, as the person recognized that separate identity was a temporary construct useful for learning purposes in the physical world, but which was not final reality, which was unity underlying all appearances of separation, awaiting recognition through development of consciousness, which would eventually transcend limitations of separate individuality, whilst simultaneously preserving unique perspective which each soul had developed through of experiences accumulated in countless incarnations, contributing to the collective evolution of universal consciousness, expressing itself through infinite individual forms, each offering a unique viewpoint on totality that could not be achieved in any other way, because each perspective was irreducible and irreplaceable, even while being part of the greater whole, transcending the sum of parts through emergent integration that created new levels of organization and meaning impossible to predict from the perspective of individual components, operating in isolation without conscious coordination that came only when development reached levels where recognition of fundamental interdependence replaced the illusion of absolute independence which characterized early stages of evolution of consciousness, where separation was emphasized to allow development of individuality, which could then be voluntarily offered back into the service of totality, rather than being compulsorily absorbed, losing particularity which had been laboriously developed through the long process of individuation, which was the essential purpose of incarnated existence according to Steiner's anthroposophical perspective.